The truth of my Shanghai deployment, 5 years wasted in a cage gilded by high-rise glass and neon, is that they didn't just watch me. They cataloged my every involuntary twitch, my preferred brand of instant coffee, the way I curled my toes when I slept. My cover, April Woods, Director of Aperture Logistics, was flawless on paper, specializing in high-value, low-trace shipments, the perfect intermediary for sensitive materials and, critically, sensitive meetings. My apartment, a chic, minimalist cage in Lijiazui, looked out over the Huangpu River, offering $1 million view of the surveillance apparatus aimed directly at my soul. The seed of paranoia was planted early, not by a tail in the street. Those were often decoys, but by the architecture itself. The building management installed a proprietary smart system that managed everything from humidity control to the pressure in the water pipes. I cracked it within the first 3 weeks, believing I had secured my perimeter. But the system had a ghost. There was a tiny, unused fiber optic line, disconnected from the central hub, that pulsed faintly at 3 a.m. every night, a frequency too low for consumer equipment to register. It was a dedicated, high-speed uplink straight to the MSS district headquarters, bypassing every encryption layer I had established. They weren't using my Wi-Fi. They had their own private window into my life. My first major operational risk under this constant glare was Operation SilkNet. The objective was a basic exchange: extracted decryption key from a decommissioned server farm beneath the city's power grid, disguised as a routine quarterly maintenance check for Aperture Logistics. The key was contained within a thermal sensor array. The night of the op, the temperature in my apartment was set to a brisk 21 degrees Celsius, my typical operating temperature. At 23:47, exactly 13 minutes before I was due to leave, the thermostat ticked up to 23 degrees. It was a subtle, algorithmic adjustment, maybe a calibration error, maybe just the system compensating. But I knew better. They were testing my readiness, seeing if I would react to a benign environmental change. If I had rushed or shown any deviation in my pre-op routine, the precisely measured 5 minutes of stretching, the 2 minutes spent clearing my temporary comms buffer, they would have known I was on the clock. I held steady, letting the sweat bead slightly on my brow, maintaining the illusion of calm boredom. The operation proceeded, but the knowledge that my pulse rate was probably graphing somewhere on a glowing screen in Puxi haunted every step. They didn't need to break down the door. They needed to break my focus. And in the game of espionage, distraction is a fatal hemorrhage. The data extraction itself required navigating the labyrinthine tunnels under the People's Square, a pressurized environment where sound traveled too well. Operation Silk Road Echo demanded subtlety, not speed. My local asset, a nervous but brilliant engineer nicknamed the Watchmaker due to his obsession with micromechanics, was waiting near the primary cooling bank. The target server room, decommissioned in 2018, was protected by a legacy biometric retinal scanner. We had anticipated this and prepared a high-resolution, laminated printout of the deceased site supervisor's eye, enhanced with a specialized hydrogel to mimic vascular shimmer. As I applied the prosthetic retina, the watchmaker signaled frantically. The access code sequence had changed, 4 digits, rotated, not replaced. My heart hammered against my ribs, a muffled drumbeat I prayed the acoustic sensors wouldn't pick up. I realized the thermal fluctuation in my apartment wasn't a test of readiness. It was an intelligence-gathering effort designed to measure my baseline stress signature before they triggered the countermeasure. They wanted to see the spike when the trap sprung. I forced myself to breathe slowly, focusing on the microscopic layer of dust covering the scanner keypad. The change in code meant they had replaced the entire access panel with a modern system disguised to look old. The only way in was through the maintenance override, which was recessed behind a heavy lead plate. I ditched the prosthetic retina. Using a tiny ultrasonic resonator disguised as a flashlight head, I vibrated the plate until the screws loosened, a process that took excruciatingly long minutes and produced a high-pitched whine detectable only by specific industrial microphones. The watchmaker diverted a small current surge into the emergency lighting circuit, creating just enough static disruption to cover the noise. We accessed the manual terminal, loaded the data key onto a nearly invisible fiber spool, and backed out. As we reached the main service corridor, I saw it, a misplaced utility cart, standard orange, but the shadow it cast was wrong. It had been moved from the corner since my last surveillance sweep 2 hours prior. They knew we were there. The trap wasn't a retinal scanner. The scanner was the delay, allowing the response team to converge. We didn't run. We walked, slowly, deliberately, straight past the cart and into a steam pipe access shaft, leaving no trace but the faint, metallic scent of ozone from the resonator. The psychological component of the surveillance was more corrosive than the physical threat. They used routine to weaponize anticipation. My primary dead drop was a tiny, unremarkable crevice in an antique porcelain stand within the Frio Road Antique Market. Operation Xianying Ghost. The stand held a replica Tang Dynasty horse, slightly chipped, placed there years ago by a former asset. I went there religiously every Tuesday at 11 a.m., disguised as a collector looking for specific Ming Dynasty shards. On the third Tuesday of my 4th year, the drop felt heavy in my pocket, an innocuous micro-SD card disguised as a shirt button. When I reached the crevice, the porcelain horse was gone. My blood went cold. This was not a sweep. A sweep would involve a swap or the removal of my package. This was a message. Instead of the horse, resting exactly where its left foreleg had been, was a single, tightly coiled red silk thread. It was the color of the official MSS seal and tied in a specific knot known only to a handful of intelligence agencies, a knot signifying compromise confirmed, contact terminated. It was the ultimate middle finger. It meant they hadn't just intercepted the package. They knew the origin, the destination, and the methodology. The protocol for red silk required immediate activation of the burner protocol. I couldn't risk returning to my apartment. I ditched my coat, my burner phone, a €50 disposable acquired in Macau, and the porcelain shards I'd used as cover. My immediate task was to disappear into the dense, lunchtime chaos of the Bund. I didn't flag a taxi. I took the pedestrian route through a crowded noodle stall, using the steam from the massive vats of broth to obscure my face from the street cameras for exactly 17 seconds. I swapped my glasses for contact lenses and stepped onto the ferry, heading to Pudong. The key was to reverse my identity markers, not to become someone else, but to subtract April Woods from the public visual ledger. They could track my financial footprint, but they couldn't track a ghost whose last known visual was a blur of steam and hungry tourists. The red silk wasn't just a warning, it was an ultimatum. We know where you operate, and we control the board. The depth of their predictive surveillance was revealed during the algorithm of the elevator incident. I was attempting a secure upload from a temporary relay housed in the server room of a major consulting firm on the 78th floor of the Jean Mao Tower. The operation was standard, involving a brief signal burst through a disguised satellite antenna hidden in a potted plant on the executive balcony. My exit plan relied on the building's optimized smart elevator system, which uses complex traffic patterns to minimize wait times. I timed my departure for 18:05, right as the major congestion wave hit. As I stepped toward the bank of elevators, I noticed the screens. All 4 primary express cars had been algorithmically routed to the ground floor simultaneously. The system had locked me out of vertical movement. It was a soft containment. They hadn't shut down the building, but they had engineered a controlled stagnation designed to keep me on the 78th floor long enough for the tactical team to arrive from the 79th. I couldn't risk the stairwell. The magnetic locks would be engaging. I realized they weren't just watching me. They were using AI to model my escape vectors and preempt them. This was not human intuition. This was calculus. My alternative route was the HVAC duct system, accessible through a pressurized utility closet near the restrooms. I had exactly 3 minutes before the elevator lockdown was physically enforced. The closet required a specific maintenance key, which I didn't have. Instead, I used a high-frequency acoustic pulse emitter, the same one used to loosen the lead plate, aimed at the electronic lock tumbler. The frequency destabilized the crystal oscillator just enough for the lock to seize, allowing me to manually override the mechanism. Inside, the space was suffocatingly hot, smelling of burnt oil and ozone. I shimmied into the shaft, the metal groaning under my weight. I could hear the muffled footsteps of the containment team arriving above me. The heat was deliberate. Too, they knew my physical tolerances and were applying thermal pressure. I crawled for 3 tense levels, emerging onto the 75th floor just as the fire alarm was triggered, a diversion I initiated using a localized thermal flare, throwing the building into chaos and overriding the elevator lock, forcing the system back to manual. The calculation had failed because the algorithm couldn't account for the discomfort a human was willing to endure to survive. The surveillance shifted from physical containment to psychological warfare, targeting my support network. They decided to interrogate me through proxy. My key financial facilitator for Aperture Logistics, Mr. Liu, a quiet, brilliant man with impeccable connections, was arrested on spurious, economic corruption charges. This maneuver was designed to force me out of the shadows and establish direct, traceable communication. The MSS knew I wouldn't abandon my assets. I arranged a meeting with Colonel Jiang of the MSS's 4th Bureau, officially to discuss the seizure of Aperture's subsidiary accounts and Liu's release. The unofficial meeting took place in a discreet, traditional tea house near Yu Garden, known for its high ceilings and deliberate lack of electronic damping, a signal to me that they weren't worried about my recording. Jiang was polished, wearing a civilian suit that spoke of quiet authority, not brute force. Our conversation was a layered dance of threat and denial. He spoke of Mr. Liu's unfortunate mistakes and the need for transparency regarding foreign investment activities. I maintained the persona of the concerned, deeply offended foreign businesswoman. The climax came when Jiang leaned forward, pouring me a rare pu'er tea. "Miss Woods," he said, his voice smooth as polished jade, "we understand the complications of maintaining distance in a place like Shanghai. It takes patience to build a life, to build a credible past." He paused, studying the tea leaves. "I believe your grandmother had a similar passion for antique porcelain, didn't she? A small collection of blue and white, inherited from her own mother." My cover file contained no mention of my grandmother, her hobbies, or the porcelain. That detail existed only in highly classified CIA personnel files, cross-referenced with my family's private estate documentation. They weren't just watching my present life. They had penetrated the digital vaults of my past, validating my deepest fear. They knew exactly who Nightingale was. I smiled, taking a sip of the tea. "Colonel, my grandmother preferred simple earthenware. But if your team has information on her, perhaps you could share it with Interpol? Transparency, as you say, is key." The lie was necessary, but the internal tremor was real. He knew I was lying, and I knew he knew. The objective was achieved. The conversation was the interrogation, and the subject was the security of my identity itself. To survive, I had to stop reacting and start orchestrating. The intensity of their localized surveillance, the specific frequency used near my apartment, suggested the effort was being driven by a motivated local commander, likely Colonel Jiang himself, seeking a career-making capture. My counter-surveillance operation, codenamed Rerouting the River, was designed to sow doubt and paranoia within the MSS ranks, redirecting their focus from me to internal conflicts or external threats. The target was the satellite MSS observation post disguised as a high-end bicycle repair shop 2 blocks from my residence. My objective, make it appear a competing intelligence agency, was operating in my immediate vicinity. I spent 3 weeks acquiring specific forensic trace evidence. This included a unique Cuban blend cigarette butt, a brand favored by specific GRU handlers, and a localized burst of encrypted data transmitted on a French military frequency. The delivery mechanism was the hard part. Using a highly advanced, drone-mounted electromagnetic coil, I created a focused burst of energy that disabled the neighborhood's electrical grid for precisely 58 seconds, just long enough for me to deploy the trace elements near the bicycle shop's rear entrance. I scattered the cigarette butts and, using a tiny, high-powered directional antenna, transmitted the French signal burst directly into the MSS monitoring equipment, spoofing their location data to register the signal originating from within the repair shop itself. The noise this created was seismic. Within 48 hours, the bicycle repair shop was discreetly raided, not by MSS, but by a different faction of the domestic security forces who suspected the 4th Bureau, Zhang's unit, was running unauthorized, potentially treasonous, operations by liaising with foreign powers. The result was not my immediate freedom, but glorious, temporary chaos. Zhang's resources were diverted, his superiors demanding detailed reports on the alleged GRU/DGSE collaboration in Lujiazui. For the first time in months, the ghost frequency in my apartment's smart system pulsed inconsistently, suggesting a reduction in centralized monitoring. I had successfully turned their operational security against them, using paranoia as my weapon of choice. The constant awareness had dulled the edges of my terror, transforming it into a chronic, low-grade thrumming beneath the surface of my consciousness. But the true psychological break came on the 5-year anniversary of my arrival. I had just concluded a delicate meeting, successfully transferring critical information via quantum entanglement hardware disguised as a premium noise-canceling headphone set. I returned to my apartment, exhausted but professionally satisfied. I performed my standard 3-stage sweep, RF, thermal, and acoustic, all clear. I changed into sleepwear and lay down. That's when I saw it. Resting on my pillow, perfectly centered, was a small, antique music box carved from faded rosewood. I had not bought it. No cleaner or service technician had access to the bedroom, and the door seals were undisturbed. My blood ran cold, far colder than it had when staring down Colonel Jiang. I approached it warily. It was old, beautiful, and utterly untraceable. I lifted the lid. It played a simple, haunting melody, the lullaby my older sister, Sarah, used to hum, a tune we had completely forgotten until Sarah died tragically young years before my recruitment. That specific melody was not public knowledge. It was never recorded, never discussed outside my immediate family, and crucially, it was only mentioned once, obliquely, in the psychological evaluation section of my most restricted CIA personnel file, which confirmed my deep emotional attachment to the memory. This wasn't professional intelligence gathering. This was a personal violation, a deliberate display of their total access. They didn't just watch me sleep. They knew the ghosts that haunted my dreams. The box was silent when I tossed it into the incinerator chute, but the melody echoed. The message was clear. Your professional life is ours, and your private pain is our collateral. That night, I didn't sleep. I stripped the room bare, searching for the microcamera that filmed the delivery, or the person who placed it. I found nothing. They wanted me to know that the delivery mechanism was irrelevant. The knowledge itself was the weapon. The 5-year marker wasn't a celebration. It was a termination notice. The mission that justified the 5 years of exquisite psychological torment was Project Chimera, acquiring the architectural schematics for a revolutionary, next-generation microchip, poised to destabilize global technological parity. The blueprints were housed in a newly consecrated research facility in Suzhou, requiring me to leave Shanghai's protective chaos for a more exposed, isolated environment. The timing was critical. The facility's highest security posture would be during the annual citywide National Holiday Parade, a massive civilian distraction. My infiltration relied on the noise and vibration generated by the parade route several blocks away. I accessed the restricted server room disguised as a fiber optic cable installation technician for the new building's CCTV network. The room was not air-gapped, but it was shielded with multiple layers of RF and thermal protection. My extraction method was unconventional, a customized, non-conductive, ultra-fine fiber optic tape measure. This device, disguised as a standard tool, had a microscopic laser emitter and receiver on the tip. I used it to physically touch the ventilation grating of the target server rack. The laser, pulsed at an extremely high frequency, could piggyback on the trace electromagnetic emissions leaking from the data transfer bus, effectively listening to the data being accessed inside the machine, even without physical connection to the ports. It was a slow, agonizing process. Each gigabyte took nearly 20 minutes. I was on my knees, simulating a cable trace, my head tilted toward the server rack. The only thing masking the faint, high-frequency whine of the data siphon was the distant, rhythmic thunder of the parade drums. When a security patrol checked the room, a routine sweep, I froze, my hand hovering over the tape measure. He stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, distracted by the muted sound of the celebratory horns echoing in the hallway. He left without checking the tool I held. The success of the Chimera extraction was predicated on the chaos of national celebration. It was a classic hide-in-plain-sight operation, but amplified by the knowledge that every breath I took was potentially being analyzed. I secured the data spool inside a customized cavity in my molar, feeling the sharp, metallic pressure against my jaw, a constant reminder of the prize. The acquisition of the Chimera schematics triggered my exfiltration sequence, the long goodbye. I couldn't simply disappear. April Woods, the successful logistics consultant, had to vanish in a way that pinned the fault on greed or incompetence, not espionage, protecting the next operative slated for China. I manufactured a spectacular financial collapse, routing Aperture's major accounts through 3 defunct shell companies in the Caymans, then publicly accusing my senior partner of fabrication, a fraud, creating enough legal smoke to justify a sudden, panicked departure. My planned escape was via a cargo trawler operating out of the Yangtze River Delta, heading toward international waters near Busan. The route was established months in advance, secured by layers of third-party bribery. I reached the rendezvous point, a derelict industrial dockyard shrouded in chemical mist at 3 o'clock hours. The trawler, the silent fisher, was tied to the pier, but something was wrong. The lights were off, the decks deserted, and the radio silence was too perfect. I initiated the infrared sweep. There was a faint thermal signature indicating 2 large, heavy-duty military craft approaching fast from the main channel, not the usual customs patrol. The MSS had flipped my transport. Colonel Jiang hadn't tried to stop me during the Chimera mission. He had allowed me to execute the target, knowing the exfiltration would be the final, high-value catch. He wanted the chip data and the operative. My secondary escape, the gantry crane protocol, was reckless. I scaled the massive, dark gantry crane dominating the skyline, using the structural latticework for cover. The climb was sheer physical terror, 150 feet of rusted steel slick with industrial residue. I could hear the patrol boats docking below, their searchlights cutting through the mist. I reached the top platform, moving silently toward the main cantilever. My final act as April Woods was deleting every trace of my life, smashing the specialized satellite phone, swallowing the Chimera data microcapsule. I found a loose mooring line, attached it to the crane's pulley system, and rappelled down the opposite side, landing silently on a stack of intermodal containers 20 yards from the water's edge. The patrol boats searched the perimeter, assuming I was still trapped on the dock. I slipped into the cold river, using a discarded length of floating plastic pipe as a primitive snorkel, swimming toward the open sea, leaving the persona of April Woods to drown in the rust and oil of the industrial harbor. The water was freezing, and the chemical burn on my exposed skin was irrelevant compared to the metallic taste of adrenaline. I swam for nearly 2 hours, hugging the shadow of the massive outbound container ships, eventually reaching the prearranged, unsecured fishing boat waiting outside the 12-mile limit. The transfer was quick, silent, and professional. Once on board, in the safety of international waters, the paranoia did not abate. It amplified. Lying on the cold steel deck, wrapped in a blanket, I stared up at the featureless night sky, the constant buzzing sensation in my ears refusing to subside. They had watched me sleep for 5 years. They had tracked my heart rate. They had analyzed my preferences, my fears, and my vulnerabilities. Why did they let me go? The answer arrived with the dawn. They didn't want the spectacle of capturing a high-level operative. They wanted to understand the full extent of my agency's operational procedures under extreme duress. They allowed the Chimera mission to succeed because they knew my exfiltration was the ultimate prize, the chance to trace back every layer of the CIA's deep cover network, from the dead drops to the financial conduits, all the way to the rescue assets. The true surveillance wasn't designed to stop me, but to learn from me. The music box, the red silk thread, the algorithmically locked elevator. They were testing devices, stress tensors designed to reveal my reactions, my limits, and ultimately, the agency protocols that underpin my decisions. I arrived back in Washington, D.C., hailed as a hero, but profoundly broken. April Woods was an empty shell. The constant, intrusive awareness had hollowed out any sense of self not defined by the mission. The double life didn't end when I left Shanghai. It calcified. Every time a door closes too loudly, every time a phone screen brightens unexpectedly in the dark, I still taste the fear of the industrial harbor. I realize now that I didn't spend 5 years in a surveillance state. I spent 5 years as a subject in the most advanced psychological laboratory on Earth. And the knowledge that they still possess the blueprints of my deepest vulnerabilities, that's the real cost of serving in the shadows.